Most sports are great at mixing sponsorship in with the action. Back in the middle of the past century, I don't know if any sport did that better than boxing did. Although, what do I know? I wasn't even alive for another 30 or 40 years when all that was going on. I just remember seeing them throw up "This middleweight championship match is brought to you by Red Wigglers, the Cadillac of worms," while the fighters were taking a break in the corner between rounds. You're tuned in, now you want some worms. But podcasting has become an ideal way to advertise in the here and now, so I will advertise Sparkplug Coffee. They stuff premium quality beans in the bag. It's the best coffee you've ever brewed, and Canadians and Americans can get their package of Sparkplug delivered right to their door. The shipping costs are zero in Canada, in fact, so it's a lot better and tastier than takeout. But having it sent whenever you need it proves just how convenient Sparkplug can be in your life. And hey, join the Autopilot Coffee Club. Pause or even cancel if you ever need to. Hassle-free. Type in sparkplug.coffee/HYES and give it a try. Our HYES promo code will snare you a one-time 20% discount. Find your new favorite, you rage-filled pugilists. Very well, you've heard our ad. Time to hear the podcast proper. Let's get back to the action. And action! Have you ever seen Somebody Up There Likes Me? Hi there, movie monkeys. Thank you oh so much for devouring another heaping helping of Have You Ever Seen, which is episode number 653. I'm Ryan Punchy Ellis, your host in this classic movies podcasting venture. I'm Punchy, even though that's a good name for a dog. It's easy to remember, it's not that hard to spell. Oh, heads up, I'll be spoiling today. It's a Friday, so no Bev here. She still won't be back on Monday either because she continues to recover from that infamous foot surgery, but she will be back on the pod on March 31st. But that's a little ways away, so let's talk about boxing. Rocky, not Balboa, was released by MGM on Independence Day, 1956, which is just July the 4th for those of you who don't know anything about American holidays. It was a break-evener domestically, but was profitable worldwide. Although Wikipedia said it was profitable regardless, didn't it? I don't know. Why aren't these things easier to find? These old movies, though. The Ten Commandments was 1956's biggest hit. The Numbers says it was number one, so the box office site, The Numbers, while Giant was third. We have covered both of those big, bombastic motion pictures. I always like to give the movie a jokey name when I first set up who released it and talk about the box office, so Rocky, not Balboa. Not Balboa. But I do want to add here that I plan to shorten the name of the movie in this review when it comes up. So rather than always say Somebody Up There Likes Me, I'll lean on the acronym Subtle Me. Has a nice ring to it. Subtle Me. And it's not that hard to spell. It's just an acronym. First letter of each word. That's how acronyms work there, Adrian. Okay, well, let's establish what's going on in this story. Robert Wise directs an Ernest Lehman screenplay, which is an adaptation of Rocky Graziano's autobiography. Of course, he's a boxer. Breaking news. Today. Paul Newman plays Rocky, although his real last name is Barbella. He names himself after a brand of wine so he can avoid the military after he goes AWOL. Needs a pseudonym. And the reason this East Side Italian was in the military in the first place is because he spent his youth stealing and being a delinquent, went from jail into the military. But he could always hit people hard, which an army guy discovers when Rocky is a corporal in the outfit. That helpful fellow trains him very hard and prepares him to be a prize fighter, which he does become after continuing to be in trouble with authorities for a few more years. But once Everett Sloane's Irving Cohen gets a chance to manage him and Pier Angeli's Norma gets the chance to love and marry him, Rocky's life gets so much better, reaching its highest point when he wins the middleweight championship of the world at the end of the movie. The middleweight champion of the world. Or, in a nutshell, hey yo, I'm fighting here. I think my accent was almost as good as Newman's was in this picture. We'll talk more about that accent later on. Okay, Rotten Tomatoes, hit me with your facts and figures. 86% of critics and the same number of audiences like it on that site. The critics' average is pretty low, though, considering that 86% figure. It's 6.6 out of 10. And there are only 14 reviews on the site, so it's not exactly a tremendous sample size. This is Oscar month, and this film won 2 of those. One was for Joseph Ruttenberg's black and white cinematography. The Academy loved this guy. He was nominated for 10 Oscars in total and won 3 other times. 2 of those were for Best Picture winners, Mrs. Miniver and Gigi, which was only 2 years after this. And even though he usually got his nominations and wins for black and white movies, his final 2 recognitions were for color films, and one of those was Gigi. I found the video on YouTube of Ruttenberg accepting his Oscar, and he didn't say a word. He just took the trophy, shook Claire Trevor's hand, and walked off. I guess he'd been at the dance enough times that he didn't feel the need to thank anybody or ramble on and on. He was the anti-Adrian Brody. The other award this movie won was for the sets. This was the final one for Cedric Gibbons, who won 11 Oscars in his career, and he shared it with 3 other guys. Malcolm Brown, Edwin Willis, and I guess Keogh Gleason. They were all like Ruttenberg, just shook hands with the presenter and smiled, took their trophies, and walked off. Jerry Lewis was the host that year, and maybe he or the producers had told the audience ahead of time that they should say as few words as possible once they won. Albert Ask's editing, say that one 4 times fast, Albert Axt, A-K-S-T. His editing was nominated too, but the Academy went with what I remember was a lumbering, long epic, even though it was also the Best Picture winner, Around the World in 80 Days. Ernest Lehman's screenplay was nominated for Best Written American Drama by the Writers Guild, but it failed to score a nomination for an Academy Award. In fact, Ernie went 0 for 6 at the big show in his career. At least they gave him an honorary award in 2001. As for Wise, he was a candidate for the Directors Guild Award for his work here, yet wasn't up for an Oscar. Of course, his name was called for West Side Story and The Sound of Music during the 60s, so he can't complain too much. And he won 4 times because he produced those 2 musicals as well as directed them. And they gave him the Thalberg Award in 1967, just 1 year after they had handed him kudos for The Sound of Music. Did they think he'd be offended if he wasn't up on stage yet again that decade? Oh, I haven't won in so long! 12 months! Paul Newman wasn't nominated either. His first nom came 2 years later when he made Cat in a Hot Tin Roof. As much as I love this guy's work, I don't think you could say he was jilted by the Academy for what he brought to Subtle Me. He'd go on to be a lot better, and I don't think he did too many more accents in the future, although this is certainly one of his most forceful and physical roles ever. More often than not, his acting style was to play it cool. It's a nice little tie to this film that when he won his Oscar for The Color of Money about 30 years later, Robert Wise was the one who accepted. Newman didn't go to the ceremony that year, I think because he was tired of getting nominated so often and never winning. But if he chose Bobby Wise to be the one to go up and get that award for him, the 2 of them must have stayed pretty friendly. Before sitting down today, I wanted to watch the clip to see what Wise said when he accepted for Newman. But after he took the trophy from presenter Betty Davis, she basically didn't let him say anything. It was Davis, though, who said what a lot of people were probably thinking, which was that this award was long overdue. She also acknowledged that Wise was the president of the Academy, so he didn't show up that night just to accept for his old buddy from this movie. He was already at the show anyway. But one more thing about the 86 Academy Awards, although of course they're held in 87, they keyed a graphic over James Woods, who was nominated against Newman for Salvador, that said James Wood singular, not James Woods plural. He was already an established actor and was nominated for an Oscar that year, that night, yet they misspelled his name. I know everybody on the left hates his guts now, but come on. That's an inexcusable blunder to misspell someone's name in that situation. And even if you do think he's awful these days, you can't deny that he's a terrific actor and at least spell the guy's name right. Oh, and since I looked up the clip when Newman won for Marty's Billiards film, I went ahead and watched the honorary award clip on YouTube the year before that, which he accepted while he was on location making The Color of Money. His co-star from Absence of Malice, Sally Field, I assume his friend by that point, talked about him and introduced him from the Oscar stage. Then she threw to him in Chicago, he's on satellite, to give a short but gracious speech. Although you have to wonder if they would have given him that award that year, if they could have known he would win it competitively the very next year. Okay, so the Oscar tangent is done in this section. Thank you for your patience. I've been indulging a lot in that this month, haven't I? It is Oscar month. As for American Film Institute representation, Subtle Me was nominated for the top 100 genres in the sports category and was also up for the AFI's Most Inspiring list, their top 100 cheers, but no dice. The movie didn't make either of those cuts. So that's the film's legacy, but since this isn't exactly a film that everybody knows very well, it's my task to introduce everybody to the story now. Robert Wise's motion picture takes place mostly in New York, which is not unusual for a boxing movie. Think of Raging Bull, for example. Perry Como sings the title song over the credits, and there's also a graphic that says, "This is the way I remember it, definitely." And that line is by The Rock himself, taken from his autobiography, I assume. Our first scene proper has Rocky Barbella's father, Nick, taunting and bullying him as a young kid. They box a bit, and then Pops decides to hit the boy hard in the face after one of his drunk friends taunts the old drunk with a wisecrack. The young Rock is appropriately cheesed off and mentally wounded by this. With a family like this, who needs family? The next scene has Rocky nearly getting picked up by the cops for breaking a store window, but he manages to run away. And since we didn't need to see Terry Rangno playing the mischievous young Barbella for too long, it's time for Paul Newman to take over as a young adult. Now, he was 30 when they made this movie, but yeah, a young adult. Eileen Heckert plays Ma Barbella, who he meets up with on the roof of their East Side apartment building. He has enough self-awareness to know he isn't an innocent victim, and he admits he doesn't know why she doesn't give up on him like everybody else does. And we also, oh, poor Rocky. Well, he probably has a right to whine a little bit. And we also see that even after all these years, since we saw him throwing hands with his own son, Dad Barbella is still a mean-spirited butthead. Rocky heads out for work and tracks down his crew of fellow delinquents, including Steve McQueen as Fidel. Did they pronounce it Fidel or Fidel or Fidel? Anyway, they steal tires right off a parked car and close off a truck while the driver's in the middle of driving it. They get into fights with other gangs, too, as Rocky shows off his talent for hitting people right in the face. He's just a rampant thief and general menace to society, and his father won't back him up, so he gets sent to a reformatory for an indeterminate sentence because he cannot be at large. Indeterminate sentence and cannot be at large are what the judge says in this movie, literally. So he's effectively a nickel boy, a white one, without the implied rape. The judge hopes prison authorities will be able to break his spirit, but Rocco fully intends to remain obstinate. He doesn't pull a Brando and say, "What do you got?" about what he's rebelling against, but he's probably right on the cusp of saying that. He's definitely in nothing-to-lose territory. You make people feel hopeless, then they're probably going to lash out. In fact, he doesn't play ball with a guard while he and other prisoners are out doing road work, the kind of thing Newman did so famously 11 years later in Cool Hand Luke. Yeah! Yeah! And he plans to kill the guy, the guard, after he wrestles his shotgun away from him. But fellow prisoner Frankie Peppo prevents that by knocking him out. I've got to knock him out. He probably saves our hothead friend from going to the chair because that would be murder. Robert Loggia plays the Frankie Peppo character, and he sounds nothing like the actor we came to know during the past 40 years or whatever it was of his acting career. All right! Didn't have that kind of voice. Okay, it's something like what we know, but he's not as hoarse as he was in Independence Day, Lost Highway, and I think even back into the 80s, Big and so on. The R-Man's difficulty with being locked up isn't made any easier when his mother visits him in the Hooskow and demands he change his ways. She's the only one who loves him and the only one who worries if he lives or dies. But her son just insists that he can't make it. I can't make it, Ma. Although he does make it after 6 years of being behind bars, finally getting released in 1942. And since that was the first year America was part of World War II, he ends up in the Army. He's forced to volunteer by two guys who approach him pretty much as soon as he walks out of prison. But he's in the Army. He's drafted in a very menacing, you don't have a choice type of way, but he's in the Army. Which isn't any easier for him than prison was, since it's even more about discipline and following orders than life in the slammer. But it isn't just the man. His fellow corporals don't want to put up with his antics either. They were drafted just like he was, but they'd rather not rock the boat the way he always insists on doing. Maybe they also realize that what they're a part of is something bigger than themselves because there is a world war going on. After being called on the carpet, Rock hauls off and punches out a captain, and the guy goes down hard. I wondered for a little bit there if he was knocked out, or even dead. I've seen the movie before, but it's been a long time, so I'd forgot. But I guess he's just knocked out because Rocky never faces any kind of murder charge or, manslaughter, that kind of thing. So Rocky panics about what will happen to him for doing this and goes AWOL, hiding out with his friend Romolo, the Sal Mineo character, which is when he remembers that Frankie Peppo said he'd help him out if he ever needed it. So what do you know? We get our first boxing in this boxing movie about 30 minutes in, as Rocky tries to track down the Frankster at a nearby gym. But the world-weary Lou Stillman tells our man that Peppo isn't there. He's in Sing Sing. I wonder if he gets the acting bug and makes nice with Coleman Domingo while he's there. Rocky volunteers to get in the ring to spar, lying to his future manager Irving Cohen that his last name is Graziano, taking it from Graziano Wines, that's on the bottle that Irving's assistant happens to be holding while standing in the ring. Guess it's better than Rocky Merlot. I am not drinking any Merlot. I may not love that movie Sideways, but I love quoting that one line, and I've quoted it 1,000 times when we have wine. Rocky has no technique at all, but he sure can hit hard, pummeling one of the top light heavyweights. He impresses Cohen so much that Irv says he wants to manage him, which Rocky is into, but not exactly enthusiastically. He just wants a few bucks out of it. He doesn't think he has a future as a prize fighter. On the night of his first fight, he's anxious, but it's a nice moment when cops come to the locker room and say, "You better come with us." He thinks he's caught, and they're taking him back to Army, mother. But they just mean he needs to walk down the aisle behind them because the crowd is raucous and they're being aggressive, so they're going to protect him, actually. The man now known as Graziano wins his first fight, and he's pretty sloppy about it. Newman's not the most convincing boxer in this at any point, but especially at this point. I guess that's also the point. He's new to this. He's also motivated to split ASAP because there are a lot of military guys in the crowd, and he thinks they might recognize him, even though he wasn't announced as Rocky Barbella. Rocky wins every match he fights by knockout 6 times, in fact. Only that's all over when authorities do figure out who he is and take him back to face the military music, which I guess is taps. And he admits he's screwed up, but he's been in prison for too long and just had to get out. Getting anywhere, getting to a boxing ring, Clarice. They say he went AWOL for 4 months. Now, new name or not, how did he stay hidden for that long? They couldn't have been looking for him very hard. He gets 1 year in the Leavenworth disciplinary barracks, and he'll also be dishonorably discharged. At least he can admit to a guy who asks what he's in for that it's for being a jerk. He actually is a pretty self-aware guy in this film. He could be a blame game kind of guy, but isn't, at least not in this scene. Our young hoodlum is learning humility. He even wants to play peacemaker with some bullies who try to mess with the smaller guy while they're all playing horseshoes, but that just leads to them getting into a fistfight. And guess who wins? Leavenworth's boxing trainer recruits the hothead to learn some proper pugilism, partly because even though he has no technique, he has something you can't teach and not many guys have: hate. Jake LaMotta had that too, more on him later, and maybe even Mike Tyson. They all got into trouble with the law. They didn't know when to turn it off, from the ring to real life. Rocky Rock is going to have to work hard to get in incredible shape if he's going to box for the army, and he'll hate the man for putting him through it. Still, the Grotz likes the pitch, and he's in. Rocky apparently is in for hardcore training, although we never see any of it, but it must have gone well because they let him out of army, and he even ends up back with Irving as his manager in the real world. So it's montage time as we see Graziano win fight after fight, attacking his poor opponents like Mr. T does in Rocky. A pit of the fool. And the more he wins in impressive fashion, the more his name keeps climbing up the card. Because who doesn't want to see not only a talented scrapper, but a guy who's viciously aggressive? People don't tune in for the glove tap at the beginning. They want to see a knockout at the end. Rocky visits home and finds out from his mama that his father gave up being a fighter for the love of Mrs. Barbella, who just couldn't handle her man doing this for a living, and he's been lost ever since. Previously on Lost. Boxers never seem to fall in love with women who appreciate their profession, and that taking these chances in the ring is just part of the gig. But speaking of love, the film has been running for close to an hour at this point, and we finally meet the second billed actor, Pier Angeli, as Norma. Although Rocky, he doesn't have time for girls. But it's his sister that introduces him to Norma. But fate is fate, so Graziano and his lady-to-be end up hanging out one night. Attraction or not, and there is an attraction. He repeats what he said earlier, that fighters ain't got much time for girls. Still, they make a date to go to the movies, or he talks back to the screen because it's a romantic movie and he has no faith in things like that. He also dumps popcorn in her hand when she tries to get too personal by trying to hold his hand. He tells Norma that what makes him feel good is the response he gets from the crowd when he's boxing, not the lovey or the dovey with a woman, and yet he wants her to at least come see him train. I guess bring you into my world, and then maybe I can actually like you or love you. And I guess that's something he normally doesn't do, train. Well, according to Irving, he won't ever train. Well, now he does. She does show up to see him, but Stillman makes her leave. He thinks a nice Jewish girl like her shouldn't be hanging out with a hands thrower from the east side. Rocky confronts her at her apartment, and they argue about how he's cut out for violence, not for the kissy-kissy stuff. Still, he gives her his word that he won't get into trouble and sent back to prison again. But then he remembers right then that because he was too fixated on making up with her, he forgot he had a fight that night, which he misses altogether. The athletic commissioner sees him, has a meeting with him, and believes it's a corny excuse, but it's also a good reason to miss the bout. Just don't let it happen again. Maybe this actually happened in real life, but I find it hard to believe that Rocky would completely forget he had a fight. Although if it's a story in the autobiography, I guess they had to put it in the film. Well, they didn't have to, but they did. Irving agrees with Lou that Rocky seeing Norma isn't a good idea, unless he marries her, be responsible and get hitched, then maybe he can focus on fighting, rather than stressing out all the time about an uncertain future with her. So they go to the courthouse for a quickie marriage. She says she loves him, and he can't say he doesn't, so they go through with it. I know it doesn't sound like it the way I just described it, but in an oddball way, this is a lovely scene. He does start doing better in the ring, partly because Norma pops out a baby Goyle, Audrey. The newspaper calls him the East Side Slugger, and our boy keeps on winning, and keeps on showing up at home with a bandaged and bruised face. He's not Muhammad Ali. He can't say, "There isn't a mark on my face." I like the bit where, as the girl grows up, she cries when she sees him looking like that, and Norma says, "It's just Daddy, it's just Daddy." And the montage continues when Audrey's a toddler and stops being scared. She's the one who says to her mom, "It's just Daddy." Even though he's been winning a lot and the neighborhood loves him for it, he does lose his first fight against Tony Zale, which Norma takes hard when she hears on the radio while listening with Rocky's mother and sister. But she realizes she didn't marry a man, she married a middleweight. and her mother-in-law has advice for her that she wouldn't take herself, and that's that she has to accept that. And of course she does. She's the Adrian of this movie. What's that line in Rocky 3 after he asks, "How'd you get so tough?" "I married a fighter." Frankie finally shows his face at Stillman's gym, I guess he got out of jail, letting Rocky G know that he should be worried that his past is going to be coming back to haunt him, all that stuff about being discharged from the army and doing time in Leavenworth. I'm surprised that didn't get around already somehow. Okay, well, maybe because everyone knows him as Graziano and his dirty military record is under Barbella. But anyway, what Peppo is there for specifically is to tell the rocker that there's big money in it for him if he'll take a dive. And now he's going to use the information about his military past as leverage. Wait, Frankie is tied up with the mob when he has a record? Not too smart. That's a great way to go away for a long time. But it's a boxing movie that isn't in the Rocky Balboa universe, so I guess there had to be a scene where the main man is told by the mafia that he has to take a dive. So he says forget everything. He fakes an injury and calls off the next fight rather than lose on purpose. He's got too much pride. And maybe it's also a matter of him thinking this is immoral to lose on purpose, not just my pride. But that's not good enough for the boxing commission. He gets called in to name names about who's asked him to take that dive, but he won't snitch. He ain't got no names to name. But when they bring in Peppo and his guys, his reaction to seeing Frankie betrays that he does know him, even though he still won't squeal. So they revoke Rocky's boxing license for not revealing what he knows, like he's a communist sympathizer or something. He basically gets blacklisted, and maybe that's part of the point of the sequence here, because of course this isn't that long after the Red Scare in Hollywood in the early 50s. And I guess through the whole 50s, really, but especially early on. And the papers run that story about how the Gratz was discharged from the army after all. These are the dark times. He's depressed, but he gets slapped by Norma when he gets ranting about all this, and he stops dead. I don't know if Wise is implying that the rock stick thought about hitting her back. Coiled rage ball that he is, he never does seem to be a danger to his wife or his daughter. And what do you know, but Irving tells him a rematch against Zale is set in Chicago, because Illinois doesn't have to do everything the New York Athletic Commission says. Although Rocky doesn't like that the fight is set in the Midwest. He knows the press out there will roast him, but oh well, not everything is easy, and it's Norma who insists that he go to Illinois and start training. Rocky beats the crapola out of various sparring partners, and yeah, he was right, does get some grief from the local beat writers. Plus the locals say crappy things to him when he and Norma are out in public. He's so out of sorts, in fact, and has to be back where life makes sense, that he catches a flight back to New York to hang out with Benny at the old soda shop, where he's gone many times throughout the film, including when she was pregnant. He had to go get things that pregnant ladies will crave, or at least this pregnant lady craved. I love how the rockster wears a great big pinky ring in his left hand through a decent part of the movie, but especially at this point, but not a wedding ring. No, I'm not a jewelry guy, but I never understood wearing a pinky ring. Oh, and I also love that you can get a slice of cake or pie in this place for only 10 cents. That's what it says on the window. His old chum Romulo comes along and asks for a little money so he can buy a gun and steal enough money to open a flower shop, which would just be a front for a bookie operation. He claims it's his only hope to make it. And even though the famous boxer should know it isn't true that crime is the only way to make it, he's already proven that isn't true. Rocky does seem to be having a huge crisis of confidence. Of course, he's a boxer, really talented at it, and Romulo is a little guy, not a boxer, so that is a little bit weird to say, you could do what I did. Well, he literally can't. Anyway, Rocky wanders around New York and sees all kinds of seedy things going on, but also sees a poster of himself in a window hawking razor blades. See right there, guy, you made it. Rocky needs some family love, so he goes to the Barbella home, but the only person there is his ever-drunk father, who doesn't even pretend to be happy to see his son. Rocky gets on his old man about how he didn't even try to make something out of himself the way Rocky did, which gets a swat from Pops, but a block from Rock. Dad cries, and Rocky feels bad about that, and about all the bad breaks his father has had. He wants to do something for him, but all his Dad Bella can say is, be a champ, like I never was. And I guess that's all Rocky needed to be motivated for that fight, because his response is, don't worry about a thing, and flies back to Norma in Chicago. It actually reminds me of the scene in Rocky 3 with Paulie when he's drunk and, I'll bust your mouth. So you got this guy who has no chance aiming at a champion caliber, well, he is a champion in Rocky 3, but a champion caliber fighter just blocking the punch, and then at the end, they make up. That's pretty much what happens here, too. And with family as well, a brother-in-law and a father. And he takes, I guess, the red eye because he seems to have gotten back very late that same night. I guess when you have money, you can fly planes, a couple of different times in a matter of hours? Of course, there is a time change there, too. Norma reveals that she's pregnant with their second kid, and her man is thrilled. So on to Zale Graziano Part 2, which a now shaven and grinning Dad Barbella listens to with Ma on the radio. I'm guessing that Dad never listened to a fight before this, or maybe he secretly did, but not so happily. As Rocky predicted, the champ is popular in Chi-Town, but the challenger is not. So we finally get the title rematch, as Rocky once again faces the only man who's ever knocked him out. Newman and Court Shepard, who plays Tony Zale, are more convincing when they throw hands when Newman and the other boxer actors were throughout the rest of the movie, by the way. Zale wins round 1, then cuts open the corner of Rocky's left eye in round 2. He's cut! And it's a bad cut. The makeup isn't consistent on Newman's face from shot to shot, mind you, but he is battling the red stuff. Zale manages to do what not a lot of people have done and knocks Rocky down. I guess he did it the last time too, didn't he? But he gets back up immediately. The play-by-play man says he's really in trouble, though, and was probably only saved by the bell at the end of round 2. It's one-sided enough that the ref wants to stop the fight, but Rocky says he'll break every bone in his body if he does. Of course, a referee only considers doing that to save a guy's stupid life. If you can't defend yourself in a boxing match any longer, then the other guy could kill you. But you ain't stopping nothing, and Rocky just keeps on attacking, even though Tony keeps tearing him to pieces when he retaliates. Even Irving is starting to think it's time to end this thing, but Rocky insists that he's got Zale right where he wants him. Yeah, Rocco, he's all yours. You look like you should go to the hospital right now, but all yours. Wise films them in pretty close here as they rock 'em sock 'em for a while. This is probably one reason why this movie won the cinematography Oscar, was some of these tight shots and the verisimilitude of so much of the movie. So they rock 'em and sock 'eming until, well, what do you know? You're gonna do it! And he blitzkriegs the champ, knocking him out. And in the 6th round, Rocky Graziano wins the middleweight championship. He's welcomed home to the east side with what would be a ticker tape parade, if they had any ticker tape. I guess that's not in the budget. He and Norma are in convertibles and being cheered on by the crowd. There's signs everywhere and slogans and things. His parents and Irving and his friends from the neighborhood are all in cars too. Everybody loves him, even though Rocky the realist confesses to Norma that he knows he'll lose the title one day, and he'll even have to hang him up somewhere down the road, because his hands are not always going to work as well as they do right now, especially the right hand. But he's grateful for what he does have, saying the name of the movie. And I think what he's actually saying in this scene, I watched it again on YouTube last night, is that he's actually more happy in a way that he has a wife, a daughter, and a baby on the way. And Norma tells him that somebody down here loves him too. I really think that Rocky, the first half of this movie, would never have said that somebody up there gave a flying piddly poop about him. He was God's lonely man. Obviously he's evolved and he's had a lot of success. I just don't know if I actually buy that the guy you watch for 2 hours is someone who would say that somebody in heaven is looking out for him. Those are the words of a positive man, which he wasn't for most of the movie. I guess you could say he is now. He's evolved. Okay, fine. But in any case, after a fanfare that shows each of the main characters get a last few seconds on screen, so their face with their real name, their credit, we are out. How about some real-life facts and figures, though, before I get to the cast? I mentioned Jake LaMotta earlier. Well, he and Rocky were friends when they were kids. Then Jake won the middleweight championship about a year after Rocky lost it. Tony Zale lost the belt to Rocky, of course, but then Zale won it back from him. They didn't include that here. And lost it to Marcel Cerdan. Now, you might remember that name from Raging Bull. He's the one who can't answer the bell between rounds, and LaMotta goes over and hugs him before Jakey Boy celebrates his win. And, of course, that's right before the scene where he and Pesci argue about, did you, my wife, and then, of course, he fights with her. That's right after he wins the championship over Cerdan. And LaMotta won that fight in June 1949, just 1 month shy of exactly 2 years after his old buddy Graziano had won it. Rocky was 67, 10, and 6 in his career. He was 3 years older than LaMotta, who went 83, 19, and 4. Rocky's 83 fights is a lot, but LaMotta had 106. He had as many wins as Rocky had fights. I've referenced Rocky Balboa a lot today. Well, I think Sly Stallone admitted that this guy was an inspiration for the Italian Stallion, along with that real-life fight that Chuck Wepner had with Muhammad Ali. And he had to. It's obvious. They both have a straight-ahead attack style in the ring, and Stallone always leads with his head, just like Newman does here. They both also play Italian underdogs with Jewish managers, and their wives are very similar in character and personality as well, so clearly Stallone was very influenced. I also found it interesting that Malcolm X had a similar trajectory in his life, the real-life Malcolm X. At least the way Spike Lee shows it in his film in 1992. Just like Rocky Graziano, he's a ne'er-do-well who gets in trouble with the law and then finds his calling while in prison. Then he becomes world famous in his field. I don't think Rocky ever stood in front of a large crowd and told them they'd been hoodwinked or bamboozled, though. Plymouth Rock didn't land on him. And of course it didn't. He's got divine help from above, and he's also white. So the cast. Paul Newman is simply one of the greatest actors in history, and his name has come up a lot in this channel. We've covered him in Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, The Hustler, HUD, Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and The Verdict. plus Chris and I reviewed Slapshot and The Color of Money on our old sports movie podcast, Scoring at the Movies. So that makes 8 podcasts on one channel and 2 more on the other. Just can't get enough of old Paulie News. He made 2 and sometimes 3 movies a year when he was in his prime, but once he turned 60 in the mid-'80s, he eased up and stopped having a prolific schedule. He even had a gap of 3 years without making a film at all, and a few gaps of 4 years in a row without being in anything. I'm going to talk on Monday during my Out of Africa podcast about how, as he got older, Robert Redford had big gaps in his career too, so these 2 old friends really compare a lot. As much as you like to see great actors work a lot, I respect that they were more selective as they aged. They didn't do the Sam Jackson, Ben Kingsley, Chris Walken thing and work in 3, 4, 5 things a year. For one thing, they both had other priorities, Redford with Sundance and Newman with car racing and charity work. But it's crazy to look at Newman's filmography and see that he was in such a good movie like Nobody's Fool in 1994, then he disappeared for nearly half a decade until he made Twilight in 1998. He was only about 30 years old while they were shooting this. He got into great shape and looks pretty excellent with his shirt off. I know Bev would agree if she'd watched this with me. Sure, just about every actor looks way better than this now, but this was quite a physique back in the mid-50s. Funny though, we don't really get much in the way of training scenes like we do in most boxing flicks, especially the Rocky movies. The trainer in the military talked about how he was going to basically torture Rocky to get him into elite shape, which sounds like excellent material for a good scene, but Wise doesn't show us any of it. Rocky certainly doesn't chase any chickens or run up the stairs of an art museum. I stumbled across a video where Newman talks about how people accuse him of just doing Marlon Brando in this film, but what the real Rocky told Newman is that Brando himself studied Rocky Graziano before Marlon made it big on Broadway in A Streetcar Named Desire, and then of course the film came out of that too. So in a one thing feeds the other kind of way, Brando was doing a version of Graziano, while Newman did his own version of the guy in the actual movie about Rocky's life. I talked about how Newman wasn't nominated for his work in this film. Maybe the Academy felt like I did, that he's laying that accent on a little thick, or that it just feels weird coming out of his mouth. But it was just his second film, and it isn't even close to his best work. I'm not ragging on the movie, it's at least pretty good. There are just better boxing movies out there, and better boxing performances. He's one of my favorite actors, and I just feel like this performance hasn't stuck with me the way so many of his other great ones do. But honored or not for this work, the man ended up being up for 10 Oscars in total, 9 of them for acting. He also got that honorary award the year before he finally got one competitively for The Color of Money, and he was given the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award the year before he was at the show as a nominee for Nobody's Fool. Their timing was weird. Let's give him an award, and the very next year he'd be up for another one, or actual competitive Oscar. If you're talking about the greatest to ever wear stage makeup, he's got to be on the list. And yes, I know it's a bad look now that they cast a non-Italian to play what the trainer says is the world's most famous Italian, other than Michelangelo or Sinatra. That's what he says. Well, they shot this thing almost 70 years ago. I think we can try to find it in our hearts to forgive these horrendous cultural appropriators after all these decades. Actually, they were going to cast another non-Italian to play the supposedly third most famous Italian, and that would have been James Dean. He died in that infamous car accident before the camera started rolling, though, so his last movie was Giant. Once the lesser-known and considerably older Newman was cast, the studio slashed the budget. That was partly because he was coming off the bomb that was The Silver Chalice, which was his very first big-screen flick. 1954, that was out. Before that, he had only done TV. MGM also made Wise shoot this in black and white, rather than grand Technicolor, although at least they didn't shoot the entire movie in a studio, which was MGM's preference. Almost always MGM preferred to be in a studio, like Hitchcock did. Wise got them to let him shoot a lot on location, which gives the story more verisimilitude. It's one of the best things about this movie. It does feel very lived in. Also, the black and white thing, they probably lucked out. Boxing probably looks better in black and white anyway. Newman wasn't, but Pier Angeli was Italian, and she played Norma. Pier had been in The Silver Chalice with Newman, a movie that he regretted being in, by the way, and had to be thrilled to get to do something so much different like this, his very next time on the call sheet. Angeli didn't even get 40 years on this planet, dying of a barbiturate overdose in 1971. I didn't recognize pretty much anything else she did beyond this, but she got nominated for various non-Oscar awards in something like 4 separate movies, so that's something. One thing I loved about her performance was how she says, "Thank you very much," because it made me think that, I didn't do that very well, did I? Thank you very much. That might be better. Because it made me think that Andy Kaufman must have taken his own "thank you very much" when he played Latka from Pier Angeli in this movie, because he does sound a lot like her. Everett Sloane is Graziano's manager, Irving Cohen. Sloane was so good as Mr. Bernstein in Citizen Kane 15 years before this. He worked with Wells again in The Lady from Shanghai, and was also in the Oscar-winning Lust for Life, the same year Subtle Me came out. Harold Stone plays Nick Barbella. He did The Wrong Man for Hitchcock that same year, and was part of the huge ensemble in Kubrick's Spartacus 4 years later. He's pretty effective here as Rocky's dad. He's a tough and bitter man. He also seems to hate and resent his son for most of Rocky's life. So I was surprised he never seems to get mad that he did something as extreme as change his name. You get famous as Graziano, you ingrate? Maybe he understood why, or his wife convinced him that he had to change it because the military would have found him otherwise, a lot sooner at least. Eileen Heckert plays Newman's ma, even though she was only something like 6 years older than he was. She's like a lot of people in this film, including Newman, in that she worked in television for years before catching a break and getting cast in this movie. 1956 was a big year for Heckert. She was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for the horror film The Bad Seed that same year, and she even won in that category for Butterflies Are Free, an early 70s Goldie Hawn comedy. And to find out how to pronounce her name, I watched her Oscar acceptance speech on YouTube. So I have another tidbit about the Academy Awards. Her speech was fine, but very brief. What stood out were two things. Robert Duvall presented with Cloris Leachman, she'd won the year before for The Last Picture Show, and Bobby laughed when he announced that Shelley Winters was nominated for The Poseidon Adventure. They showed her face right after he said that the way he did, and she looked annoyed. And I think she had a right to be. What are you doing, Bob? The other thing is that Heckert was seated in the middle of the aisle, so she had to squeeze past about 6 people to get up on stage. You never see that now with acting nominees. Even if they're not big-name movie stars, they're normally sitting on the end and can get right up. The teenaged Sal Mineo, so he's age-appropriate in the early part of the movie anyway, was in Rebel Without a Cause the previous year. We, of course, reviewed Rebel Without a Cause way back when, as we did Giant, which came out the same year as this, and he's in that too. He worked with Newman again in 1960 when they made Exodus. Exodus. On the crappy side, Sal was like Pier Angeli, in that he didn't even live to be 40. He was murdered when he was just 37. Joseph Buloff is the soda jerk Benny. He went on to have parts in high-profile projects like Silk Stockings and Warren Beatty's Reds. A nice tie-in with Stallone's Rocky is that Irving Second in this movie is the guy who played Cutman Al Silvani in the first 2 Rockies. He's the one who slices open Rocky's swelled shut eye, "You gotta cut my eye," at the end of the fight against Creed in the very first Balboa picture. I think he's the one carrying that wine bottle in the ring when Rocky takes his name Graziano as well. Okay, bring on some big names who weren't exactly treated like they were big names in this film. They weren't then, but they became such big names. Robert Loggia, or if you're Tarantino, Loggia, was making his debut as Frankie Peppo. Even though he's in the movie a lot and he's a vital character, he wasn't billed. I don't get that. He went on to have a pretty great career and was in many things we reviewed. An Officer and a Gentleman, Psycho 2, Big, Independence Day, and Lost Highway. All right! And then there's Steve McQueen, who has an uncredited role as Fidel, one of Rocky's friends in his stealing days. He, of course, went on to star in 3 classics that we've reviewed, The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, and Bullet. He also shared the marquee with Newman in The Towering Inferno 18 years after this. And as much as I normally prefer Paul as an actor and as a man, I think Steve was better in the Fire movie than Newman was. And George C. Scott is in this too. He's uncredited and it's a tiny role, but he's one of the prisoners during Rocky's bad boy days. George, of course, went on to win an Oscar that he rejected in Patton 14 years later. He also had that fantastic role as Burt Gordon alongside Newman in The Hustler 5 years after this, and was hysterically funny as Buck Turgidson in Dr. Strangelove. So I guess that makes 4 times for him on this channel now. The director was Robert Wise. He was more of a workmanlike professional than a director with flair or a signature style, but he won 2 Oscars for directing, for West Side Story and The Sound of Music. He also won trophies for producing them. Wise also directed the classic sci-fi thriller The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951, but he started out as Orson Welles' editor on Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. We've covered all 5 of the flicks I just mentioned. He really did dip into all sorts of genres, showing more range than most directors do. He started out in low-budget horror and thrillers, then he did the first Star Trek movie towards the end of his career. He was also the man behind the classic scary movie The Haunting, and he directed another gritty and vivid boxing movie, The Setup, which I've hyped up before on this channel. If you're interested, keep an eye on TCM. They run The Setup all the time. Ernest Lehman typed out the screenplay, based on the 1955 autobiography Rocky wrote with Roland Barber. Lehman also wrote Sabrina, Sweet Smell of Success, North by Northwest, West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I've heard that he didn't actually write that, but he has credit on it. That's a great resume, but I'm a giant fan of Sweet Smell and Virginia Woolf in particular. I mentioned the cinematographer Joseph Ruttenberg's credits earlier, including that he won his 3rd Oscar for this. Albert Ask's last movie was this one. He cut a lot of musicals, and one of those was Meet Me in St. Louis, which we reviewed a few years ago. Bronislaw Kaper won an Oscar for composing the music for Lily just 2 years before this. He also did the music for Gaslight, the one that won Ingrid Bergman her first Oscar. And the cameraman on that was Joseph Ruttenberg. All right, final thoughts time. I like this just fine. I wouldn't put it in my top 10 favorite boxing movies ever, nor my top 10 favorite Paul Newman performances ever. He is committed, though, and that screen presence and charisma were so evident that you have to wonder why it took until he was in his late 20s to finally get him starring roles in movies like this. But yeah, it's a vivid biopic, and typical for Wise, it's well made. It's also cool to see guys who would become so well known in the future be this, hey, I recognize him type of guy. Loja and McQueen and George C. Scott. So this isn't a ringing endorsement, but if you check this out when it airs on TCM, you could do a lot worse. So that was how I saw Somebody Up There Likes Me, Subtle Me. I'm going to let you know how to contact us and also let you in on what's coming up on this channel in a matter of seconds, or about a minute maybe. But you know what happens at this point in my monologues? Trivia questions. I've got 3 of them. And since we're still in Oscar month, I'll make these relevant to the Academy Awards. So question number 1. Paul Newman had those 9 Oscar nominations. Only 5 people in history had more, including Streep, Nicholson, Olivier. But 3 other men had the exact same number of nominations that Newman had. Who are they? Who are the 3? Question number 2. Steve McQueen has a small role in this film that went on to become a legend, but he only ever got 1 Oscar nomination, which was for The Sand Pebbles in 1966. Who directed that film? And question number 3 requires a spoiler alert for Paul Newman films. So getting back to Paul's 8 acting nominations, so he had 9, but 1 was for producing, so 8 acting nominations. And how many of those 8 flicks did his character die? Okay, the answers to those very soon. First, I'll say to you that the next time I do a solo show will be in 2 weeks. It will be April the 4th that day, and we'll be starting another Revenge Month, which has become a trend in recent years, covering vengeance-filled films in April. So on the 4th, I'll do Old Boy, the Chan-wook Park original from the early 2000s, not the Spike Lee remake. Or is it Park Chan-wook? Well, I'll figure that out in a few weeks. I think it actually is Park Chan-wook, right? That's how they do it in a lot of Asian countries. What we think of as the last name is the first name, vice versa. Before we get there, though, we'll be posting an episode on this channel the next couple of Mondays. I'll still be talking to myself this coming Monday because Bev continues to recover from her surgery. So I'll be talking about the 1985 Best Picture winner, and Newman's buddy Redford is in this, Out of Africa, and that'll be in 3 days. But another spoiler alert on March 31st, not such a spoiler. Bev will be back for that episode, and it will be Mad Max, Fury Road. Rate our podcast if you would. Write a review about it. Also subscribe to us in your app. We post on YouTube too, at HYES Ellis in the search bar will get you there. So subscribe, but also feel free to comment and help us out by liking the show. Please like the show, I beg you. You can get in touch with us by writing an email. HaveYouEverSeenPodcast@gmail.com. Bev is at Bev Ellis Ellis on Twix, and drop the @ because she's Bev Ellis Ellis on Blue Sky. I'm at MovieFiend51 and Ryan-Ellis on Twix and Blue Sky, respectively. Also buy Sparkplug Coffee. Their website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. That HYES bit at the end is our promo code. It'll save you 20% off your next order. All right, then, let's fire off the answers to those trivia questions. Number 1, Paul Newman had those 9 Oscar nominations, 8 for acting. Only 5 people in history had more, but 3 other men had the exact same number of nominations that Newman had. Who are those 3? They are Denzel Washington, Al Pacino, and Spencer Tracy. Denzel and Spencer even won twice, while Al has only won once. Question number 2. Steve McQueen has a small role in this film, then he became a legend, but he only ever got 1 Oscar nomination, and that was for The Sand Pebbles. Who directed that? It was the director of this film, Robert Wise. And Steve went home empty-handed that year because that was the year Paul Scofield won for A Man for All Seasons, but should have been the year that Richard Burton won for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And question number 3, which requires a spoiler alert for Paul Newman films, getting back to his 8 acting nominations. And how many of those 8 films did his character die? So again, spoiler. 2, in Cool Hand Luke, and in his only nomination for Best Supporting Actor, Road to Perdition. So that's a wrap. Thanks for going a few rounds with me here at the beginning of spring. Yeah, we went a few rounds. Join me on Monday when I yap about Out of Africa. Meantime, I'm going to try to win the middleweight championship. Even though I'm about twice as old as I should be to get into the ring, I've never hit anyone in my life, I don't have the eye of the tiger, and I'm dozens of pounds too heavy for that weight class. So you're saying I have a chance? And cut.